Hey guys, Nate with Zebros Racing. Today we're going to talk a little bit about shock adjustments on your UTV. Particularly we'll be showing our Exit X2 shock, but the adjustments are going to be similar on the Walker Evans and the Fox shock. Very similar actually. So for talking points, there's a couple of things you're going to want to know. Your top spring is your tender spring. Especially in a dual rate application. There are some triple rate applications, very few, but in a dual rate application, this top spring is called your tender spring, and then the lower spring is your main spring. So this is a dual rate application that also has crossover adjustments. So inside of your tender spring, or helper spring as some people like to call it, you have a crossover nut. This is our shock, so it's a single crossover nut that has a pinch style adjustment so that you can lock it down once you get your position. Some other brands will utilize two nuts that lock together, similar to their preload adjustment. And then you have your preload nut, which is going to be your top piece up here, and we'll go to a shock that's on the table to explain that better. And then up top you're going to have your compression adjustment, and then down below you're going to have a rebound adjustment. So let's go up here to the table and I'll show you on a shock that's out of the car. Now anytime you're making shock adjustments, especially to your springs, you're going to want to take the weight off of the car with a jack. This one happens to be off of the car, so the shock's fully extended. But when you're doing the adjustments on the car, you're going to have to throw a jack under it, and you have to get the weight off the car so that you can make a preload adjustment. Now, on this particular shock, it's a compression and rebound adjustable. It's our Exit X2. This is a remote, and it's dual rate. So a couple of tools that you're going to need. You're going to need whatever size Allen is required by the brand. Ours, I believe this one's a 3/16 up here on top, so that you can loosen this pinch bolt. And once that's loose, you'll be able to turn the preload nut, usually by hand, to set your preload. Now if you can't move it by hand when the weight is off the car, you can utilize a punch to go in these little round holes, and that's what that's for. One thing I like to do is I'll buy just a cheap screwdriver and I'll cut off the end of the screwdriver, and that gives you a handle, and you can stick that in any position and utilize that to adjust your preload when it's on the car. You can use a longer one or a shorter one, or just a punch set. Try to avoid using an Allen because it's not round and it can bugger up the hole. So punches are usually handy in your toolbox, or just cut off a screwdriver and go that way. Now for your crossover nut adjustment, you're going to need another small Allen, and you'll have to loosen both of the set screws. And we have two style of crossover nuts, one that is like the one shown here, that's a single piece, and then on the Walker Evans applications, the majority of the Walker Evans applications, it's going to have 4 screws. It'll have 2 here and 2 here because it's a 2-piece, which allows you to not have to take the shock apart to put the crossover nut on. On our shocks and most of the Fox shocks, you can thread the crossover nut from the bottom before you put the springs on and just run them up your threads. So when it comes to adjusting your shock, no matter what you do, it doesn't matter how many clicker styles you have, whether it's a Fox or a Walker Evans, with compression only, with dual speed, high speed, low speed, you want to adjust your preload and your crossover first. Now when you buy our spring kits for your factory shocks, or our Exit 2.5-inch shocks that we have here, it's going to come on our shock set up pretty close to a good starting point. Now on your Walker spring kits and the Fox spring kits, there's going to be some specs in there that tell you where to start with your preload, and usually that term in the instructions, if I stand this shock up, is going to start from a 0 preload point. So right now my spring has no tension on it, and I'm going to turn that collar down until it touches the spring. So now I've taken the slop out of the spring pack, but I have not preloaded the spring pack at all. So this is a 0 preload setting. So in our instructions we'll talk about from 0 preload, you're going to add a certain amount of turns. Now this lock or pinch bolt, as we call it, that we loosen with our Allen, that's a good reference point to count your revolutions. So say you're going to start with, let's say, 6 revolutions of preload. You would simply just turn this nut clockwise or stiffer and compress the spring 6 full rotations or 4 rotations or whatever the instructions say. So, and when you get to a point where it's too hard to turn by hand, that's where you would come in with your preload tool, your screwdriver or your punch, and put in one of these holes, and then you'll be able to have more leverage to turn it and put more preload in. After that preload is set, that's what's going to set your ride height of the car. And on most all UTVs, for a recreational type application, it's going to change as you get into racing and things like that, but for a recreational application, you're going to want your car to sit fairly level. So you don't want your front end sitting 2 inches higher than your back end, or your back end sitting 2 inches higher than your front end. You want that car to set pretty level, because as soon as you get in the vehicle, add weight to the vehicle, and step on the gas, it's going to weight transfer, and naturally your back end's going to sink a little bit. So always try to start with a good level ride height. Our setup instructions are going to tell you to start with a certain amount of turns of preload. That's simply just a starting point. So if you add 100 pounds of weight to the back of the car, you're going to need to adjust your preload to bring the ride height of the car back up to level after adding that extra weight. Once you have that preload set and your ride height's good, from there, after your preload is set, then you'll set your crossover point. So you'll loosen those little screws, and you can spin these crossovers by hand. It's very important to make sure that your shock is clean when you're doing this, or you know, freshly out on the trail. If you've got tons of mud and grime in these threads, you're not going to be able to make a good, accurate preload or crossover adjustment. Most of the time these won't turn because you get sand down in the threads, and then you can damage the threads. So clean it off or do it back at your shop before you leave. Now on crossover adjustment, when we talk about a crossover distance, we're talking about the distance from this spring divider, the black spring divider, to the face or the edge of this crossover nut. So it's a travel distance. And this again has to be set and measured when the shock is fully extended. Now on our shocks, we don't run any internal bump stop springs, but Fox, IBPs, some of the Dynamics cars, even the newer Walker Evans cars, they have an internal bump stop spring. So you really have to have the shock on the car, and you have to have it hooked up and be pushing down on the wheel and tire to fully extend the shock so that you can get an accurate preload and an accurate crossover measurement. That's one thing that people misunderstand a lot of times in the instructions is they think that the shock is fully extended, when in reality, because of an internal spring, it's pulling the shock closed or compressing the shock, you know, an inch or an inch and a half. So you go until you touch the spring, and then you put 4 turns, and then you put it on the car, and it fully extends, and now you have a ½ inch of slop. That's because your preload setting is not correct. So on different models, just pay attention to those instructions. It should point it out, but always make sure that the shock is fully extended. So again, your first adjustment to get your ride height correct is always going to be preload. Now the crossover that we were talking about, the cool thing about having a dual rate spring combination with crossover adjustment is you can utilize this crossover nut to actually tune your bottoming resistance separate from your ride height. So if you get a good ride height and the car goes through, let's say, the 2-foot whoops really good and the 3-foot whoops really good, but yet when you G out in the sand dunes and you hit the bottom of a dune, or you go off of a big flat landing, you feel the car bottom. Well, adding preload is not going to help you there. What you need to do at that point is move your crossover nut closer to the mainspring, so that when it's coming through its travel, it's able to transfer that energy out of the tender spring a little bit quicker and onto your stiffer mainspring. So by moving this nut 2 revolutions or 3 revolutions, you can make a massive change in your bottoming resistance. It's very sensitive. Sometimes all it takes from the car bottoming more than you would like to not bottoming is turning this collar 2 or 3 revolutions closer to the mainspring, and that'll make all the difference in the world. So those couple of adjustments are always going to be your go-to to dial in your spring kit or your shock. From there, you can utilize your compression adjuster, and if you have it available, a rebound adjuster to dial the car in. So if you get it working good in the whoops, you get it taking big jumps good and G-outs good, but you're getting a little bit of harshness in smaller bumps or things like that. You can soften up your compression dampening, or you can open up your rebound adjuster. Now on our shock, because we have a rebound adjuster, there sometimes is confusion as to how this knob works. The way I try to explain it is it's just like you're tightening a nut on the end of a bolt. So if this was threaded, turning it clockwise or righty-tighty is going to make your rebound dampening stiffer. Turning it to the left or counterclockwise, like you're loosening a nut, is going to speed up and soften your rebound dampening. And it's the same on the compression knob over here. To the right is going to be firmer, and to the left is going to be softer. And it's the same on every brand, whether it's a Walker Evans shock, Velocity Walker Evans, or a Fox shock. Compression dampening and rebound dampening. To the right is going to be stiffer, and to the left is going to be softer. And again, like I said, the clickers, what I like to do is set my ride height on the car, get my crossover where it should be, and then I put my clicker adjustments in the middle of the range. That way I know I can go stiffer or softer to fine tune if I like where my spring setup is. Sometimes people will just immediately go to their clickers trying to make a big adjustment. The clickers, again, are just to fine tune and dial in the car. The majority of your work is done with the springs. That's why the spring kits work so well on factory shocks, is because most of the tuning improvement to be made is by having a proper mainspring and tender spring setup, and again with a crossover nut, because that's a very critical aspect that doesn't come on the Polaris RZRs, and especially the XP1000, the turbos, and some of the other models. By not having that crossover adjustment, you really are limited in what you can do for bottoming resistance. So if you have questions, call us up. Just read through your instructions thoroughly when you're doing your spring kits, and just remember that ride height is always adjusted by preload, and bottoming resistance is generally fine-tuned with your crossover adjustment. So again, if you have questions, check us out, zebrosracing.com, for all of your UTV suspension needs.